Morning at NTV.
Welcome to our Kickstarter. It's Morning at NTV, Tuesday's edition, the 21st of November 2023. We're going to be focusing on embracing full African air transport and its potential, building the capacity of African airlines and their takeoff into the future. Of course, there are only so many times it is possible to highlight the prospects of growth in aviation across the African continent while still maintaining enthusiasm that the huge potential can be realized. For Africa, it represents the last frontier of aviation development, but most importantly, you do look at governments and transport strategies also being scrutinized and the ongoing protectionism practices across the continent being the hindrances of aviation in Africa. There is mild hope of regulatory processes, while perhaps the greatest optimism attached to all of this to some very persistent attempts to expand the LCC operations in the region. However, airline failings across the continent cannot simply be dismissed on such grounds. Poor management practices as well as government restrictions, and that is also regarding operational freedoms that have severely impaired the natural progression of the aviation industry across Africa. So to inspire some potential of how the aviation and airlines in Africa can be sustained, we are joined by Mr. Allan Kilavuka, Managing Director as well as the CEO of Kenya Airways, to give us a perspective of the aviation industry. Good morning, sir.
Good morning, Priscilla.
You're most welcome.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so let's start with the history of airlines. Of course, in the 1920s, you did have commercial passenger aviation being introduced in Africa. In the 1930s, you did have the South African Airways, which was, born from Africa by Africa. And thus far, 93 years down the road, the aviation industry is still ongoing, but not as strong as compared to the other continents. But how many strides have we taken to get to where we are today?
Thank you very much. Very good question. So first off, I think it's important to note that aviation is very critical for economic development. In fact, some say that it is the biggest or the most effective catalyst for economic development. Why? One, because it enables movement of goods and people. Secondly, because of the quality of people that it employs, both directly and indirectly. And then, of course, it has impact on other sectors as well, like tourism and agriculture and so on and so forth. So it is very important. Now, in the 60s, when Africa got independence, one of the things that the African continent did was to launch national carriers and so on. And the one thing that we did right then that we are not doing right now was that we set up organizations which were scalable. What do I mean by that? You think about Air Afrique, for example, which was an airline which was a conglomerate of different countries. You think about East African Airways, same thing. What we are doing today is that we are reversing the clock. We are going in the opposite direction. We are now setting up individual airlines, like Uganda Airlines, like Kenya Airways, like Air Tanzania, and so on and so forth. While in Europe and in the West, in Americas, in America, for example, in the financial crisis, they consolidated the aviation industry. So yes, we've made strides. We are growing. I think we are growing at about 5%, which is probably the highest growth of aviation. But we are coming from a very low base. So we have a long way to go. And Africa as a continent is very large, physically large continent. So it needs aviation for it to prosper, for it to grow, for the economies to mature. And I'll give you two quick examples. How did Dubai become Dubai? Yes, of course, they came up with the right strategies, with the right focus. But for it to be enabled to grow, it needed an airline, which flew to as many places as possible. Same story as Singapore. Same story as Qatar. And there are many, many other examples. So aviation is a catalyst, and it's important for Africa, is what I'm trying to say.
Okay. All right. I would like to beg your comparison. You've talked about the consolidation, Air Afrique, that was combined with many countries, and then you have also talked about the East African Airlines. When we compare those consolidated forms of aviation versus what we have today, you have Kenyan Airways, Uganda Airlines, Rwanda Air, and so on and so forth. Which one is better for us to use as Africa now? The consolidated one or the independent state-owned?
There is no doubt that it is much, much better to have a consolidated aviation industry. There's no doubt about it. And just to prove my case, I was saying earlier, let me take Europe, for instance, which, by the way, has a much bigger scale. One airline is much bigger than all these airlines combined. But still, they find time and space to say, KLM, which is a big airline in its own right, Air France, which is a big airline in its own right, they come together. Why? Because they want to use synergies. You know, a consolidated aviation is very expensive. One aircraft is $200 million. So it's a very expensive venture. So the bigger you are, the more consolidated you are, the better. You bring down the unit cost of operations. And so it becomes much easier for you to roll out and to grow and to scale. Because you also share assets, you know. So it's much, much better for Africa to consolidate. What we are doing now is a disservice to the African people.
Okay. All right. Let's relate that, the consolidation, to the economic development that you talked about, that aviation strongly contributes to the economic development, not just of the country, but with consolidation, it will be regional. So in regards to that, with the free air, the airspaces that were being pushed through the African Union Committee, then you also do have the African continent of free trade that is also being advocated for strongly. If we merged those two, how far would Africa be in terms of economic development?
So, you see, aviation is estimated, depending on the country, depending on the policy of the country, it can contribute between 4% to even sometimes 10% of the GDP of a country. So Africans need to, first of all, you mentioned Africa Continental Free Trade Area. So that means people need to move, goods need to move freely, okay? And as we know, Africa is the least connected continent in the world. So when I'm advocating for consolidation, what I'm saying is, we need to make the airlines, Uganda Airlines, for example, Kenya Airways, Air Tanzania, Rwanda, and so on and so forth. We need to make them more viable so that they can expand, so that they can share assets, so they can fly to more places. So that is why it is important for us to think strategically, not very selfishly, about having a national flag on your tail, okay? It is a good thing to do, yes.
It's a national pride.
It's a national
Here in
pride.
Uganda, we call it the national carrier.
Yes.
I've also had it in Kenya Airways being called the national carrier.
Yeah.
It gives a sense of pride to
Correct.
society, to the population, and confidence to the government.
Yeah. And there's a solution to that. By consolidation does not mean that you remove the flag. Okay? You can say, fine, you fly, you know, using the flag, Uganda Airlines. But at the top, everything needs to be consolidated so that when you're going to negotiate with the lessors, you're going to negotiate with the manufacturers, with the original equipment manufacturers, you can go as a unit. Okay? If I want to buy 10 aircraft, Uganda Airlines wants to buy 5, Tanzania wants to buy so and so, we go together. So we get a better deal. So we have much better bargaining power. It's common sense, really. And that is why you find that the big airlines, when they consolidate, they have a lot better bargaining power.
Okay. All right. We are joined by Mr. Barry Kashambo, who is an aviation specialist, and we would like to pick his mind on right where he joins us from. Good morning, Mr. Kashambo.
Good morning to you. Thanks very much.
It's a pleasure to have you. So we were talking about consolidation versus what we have as independent national carriers today, and how it can actually elevate economic development across the African country.
Thank you very much. And thanks, Alan, for the fantastic input you have made so far. I would like to expand on the consolidation. You know, consolidation, you have to add collaboration, cooperation, alliances, and cost reductions. Those are very important because, as Alan mentioned, Africa is the least connected globally. But at the same time, it's the most expensive continent in terms of tickets. And our economies are weak. We have a very weak middle class. So at the end of the day, you have an industry that is very expensive. First of all, for operation, the airlines have got very high operational cost. Secondly, the fares are very high, so we cannot afford, as a common person cannot afford. So they came, it's of paramount importance. And what hurts some of us is to see that we are going backwards. This consolidation we're talking about happened in the 1950s. In the 1960s, we had Air Afrique, which was in the West, East African Airways. East African Airways was flying to Europe, to Asia, Singapore, Hong Kong, Japan in 1969. And now we are talking about, simply because they had economies of scale, they had consolidation, unified maintenance services, and so on and so on. Training was very simple. They had this Sorority Flying School, which was teaching all the pilots for this from the 3 countries, and yet now we have receded from where we were in 1960s. Now we're in 2023, and we're in a worse situation. Now, you talked, give me a minute, you talked about the benefits of trade, aviation to trade and tourism. If you go to chapter 4.4 in the agenda, African Union Agenda 63, under infrastructure there's a chapter 4.4, and it comes up with four very important flagship products. They call them. What's the core SATAM? I hope you have talked about it. The single African air transport market that will open the connections, and of course now when you have consolidation, this becomes better when you have got the market. Number 2, they said they should have a single airspace for Africa. That makes it very easy. The navigation tax go lower, the navigation services go lower. Number 3, said visa restrictions. That you should, Africa by 2018, and it's stipulated there, by 2018 this continent was supposed to be visa free. Number 4, African passport. We're supposed to have had an African passport by 1920, something like that. Then you have African free trade we have just talked about. It's taken off, but it's still limping. So unless we walk the talk, starting from the summit and coming down to the ministries of transport and now to the airlines, it's going to be very, very difficult to make transport in Africa affordable. As you could have, maybe I think you mentioned it, we only contribute about 3% to the global traffic. That's too low. So we are not on the high table.
So all that global traffic that you're talking about,
yes.
Let's take a case scenario. Uganda Airlines has opened a route to Mumbai. Kenya Airways has a route to Mumbai. How does that affect that global percentage?
Imagine if they had an alliance.
Yes.
They would be having this alliance consolidated. Now Kenya Airways wouldn't have, would take maybe one flight but a bigger plane. Then competition will go down. Then it's all right. You do the feeding from here, even from the domestic flights. Let me give you an example. In the 60s, during the days of East African Airways, you could fly from Nairobi to Kasese. Go Nairobi, there's a flight which will take you to Arusha. Then when you get to Dar es Salaam, there will be another flight that is now going to Mbeya or Dodoma and Mwanza. Then you go to Entebbe, then you go to Kisumu. You have started your journey from Nairobi. Then you go to Kasese, I mean. You go to Tororo. You go to Gulu. You go to Kisumu. I mean, the connections under that consolidation are amazing. If we could just go back to where we were in 1977, that would be amazing.
Okay. Does this speak into the fact that, for example, the Uganda Airlines, it had to crash at some point? It's just been revived recently. For Kenya Airways, I know that you've also had issues in that regard. The nationalization of aviation, what are the advantages that have actually come out of that? Because I'm sure by the time you took that direction, there was things that you saw were positive to actually get into aviation as independent states.
But by nationalization, you know, by nationalization you mean making the airline owned by government. Is that what you mean?
Yes.
Okay. So the whole point is nationalization in and by itself is not a problem. The problem is interfering with the operations of the airline, because aviation is very, very complex. Running an airline, and I'm not saying that because I ran one, but it's a fact of life. Running an airline is one of the most difficult things, one of the most difficult businesses. Probably, I would say, it is way up there with probably running a nuclear site, because everything about aviation is complex. The margins are very, very thin. The product is very perishable. It's very expensive to fly, very expensive equipment, very expensive labor. Everything is very, very complex. So nationalization, you know, if nationalization, it means supporting the airline and funding the airline from a capital point of view, then yes, that's a good idea. But if by nationalization you're talking about politicians interfering in running of the airline, that's a very bad idea. Because we've seen nationalized airlines. We've seen airlines that are owned by government, for example, in the Middle East, and some in Africa, which are doing extremely well. We've also seen airlines which are run by government, which are doing extremely poorly. What is the difference? The difference is very simple. The ones that are doing very well are running independently, but they are supported by government through funding. The ones that are doing poorly are being interfered with by government. That is simply the answer, and it's a fact of life. It's there to see. You can see, I don't want to name names, but you can see airlines that are doing well, and if you ask the question, why are you doing well, it's because we are being run professionally, and there's absolutely no interference by government.
Okay, speaking of running, you're running KQ. Let's look at the months of first half of the year 2023. What has been the performance like, losses and profit?
Yeah, so we've done extremely well, you know, because for the first time after 6 years, we made what is called an operating profit. So operating profit is a profit in your operations. The only thing that is now plaguing us is what I call the sins of the past, which is the heavy loans that we took. So we have a lot of finance charges, and then we also have an economy in Kenya which unfortunately is suffering a lot of loss when it comes to foreign exchange. So Kenya shilling has lost quite substantially against the dollar. So we have to post the loss. It's called an unrealized loss of exchange between the Kenya shilling and the dollar, because our loans are in dollars. But from an operations point of view, we are now profitable, so we are now, we call it viable. We expect that these results will also reflect at the end of this year. And what we have promised the public and the stakeholders is that next year, we will now not only be operationally profitable, but we'll have net profitability at the bottom line. And this is because of the lot of work that we've done, the team that has done, to try and turn around the fortunes of Kenya Airways. But what I'm saying from a sustainability point of view, aviation, you know, in aviation we say, big is good, small is ugly. Why? Because the bigger you are, the more you're able to spread your costs so that your unit cost becomes lower. But the smaller you are is, you know, you have, because, you know, in aviation, safety department is safety department. Okay? You have to have a safety department. But if you have more assets to spread the cost of the safety, then it reduces the cost of production. So these small airlines that we are setting up in Africa, as long as they are small, they will not be sustainable. They have to be big. That is one other reason I'm pushing for us to have a consolidated aviation space. And I'll just say one more thing, Priscilla, if you allow me, say this. You see, in Africa, aviation is not a luxury. Unlike what policymakers think, that, you know, this is for elitists who can afford an air traffic. Do you know how many buses come from here in Kampala to Nairobi? Every day, 15. 15 buses are flying Nairobi, Kampala. Not because they want to be in a bus for 8 hours.
Yeah, the time I was coming from north of Uganda back to Kampala, and I counted 25 buses in just the time I was on the road. So I was imagining the time I'm not on the road, did the mathematics, and that was billions and billions of Ugandan shillings.
So if if we have 15 buses every day from Kampala to Nairobi, it means people want to talk, people want to visit Nairobi, people want to visit Kampala, people want to trade. Okay? It is only that they cannot afford an air ticket.
That's true.
Yeah. So we have to make air tickets affordable. Let me tell you one more statistic that will hopefully make you disappointed. Barry was talking about you know, the way the East African community used to operate, because we had domesticated air travel. In other words, for me to come here to Kampala, I was just coming home. And if you go to Nairobi, you're going home. So it's all one big community, it's all one big country. But now, if I want to come to Kampala here, I have to pay tax, what is called passenger service charge. Now, a return, it will be $110, okay? And of course, the other way as well. And if you go to Tanzania, same thing. That is a tragedy. Because in Nairobi, if I want to fly locally, the only passenger tax is $4. I only pay $4, as opposed to $110. So you can imagine if I removed the $110 from your ticket.
Definitely.
How that would help.
I'd be having Christmas in Nairobi.
Yes. Or Mombasa.
Mr. Kashambo,
Yes.
in regards to the same, of course, what he has mentioned is very, very crucial. Let's talk about within the region, East Africa. We have tried to have the East African passport, us as Ugandans right now, the new passports we're
Very
getting.
successful project.
Very successful project. Thank you very much. You have talked about the free visas.
The
visa-free
freedom of movement.
Yes.
Yeah.
In regards to regional movement, how will that visa-free movement actually apply in boosting trade and boosting economic development? And why are we failing to actually adopt to that?
Okay. Now you need to look at the way aviation integrates with the other sectors. If you look at it in reality, even if Allan was to just break through, that would be good enough for the country, because aviation is an enabler for the other sectors, for tourism, for trade.
For energy.
What you don't want is to have a loss. But even if it was to break even, then the country would benefit. And there are some states that are really having moving in a good direction towards that, looking at aviation as an enabler for the other sectors. And so you were asking, how do you think this consolidation will help? Consolidation has apparently, when you look at it, it has almost all the benefits you want to talk about, because you are having a single. It will reduce on the as it says, if you consolidate and domesticate, you have reduced travel cost, you have reduced operational cost, you have ease in the setting up your routing, the connectivity within the regions, west, central, and north will be eased. I mean, the benefits are very many. But the challenge, as he mentioned, my background, I'm in the regulation side. I've just been a regional director for the East and Southern Africa region for International Civil Aviation Organization. We have rigid requirements from the regulator side. And these people must comply with them, whether they like it or not. We even come and do an audit and tell them, you are not doing well. But there must be that flexibility where if you are sharing resources, you end up into cost effectiveness. So economies of scale, very, very important. Sharing of personnel. If Uganda Airlines doesn't have an engineer in a certain section, Allan will give him somebody from Nairobi to come and sort out the issue, because they are in a consolidated unit. So it adds so much value. That's why you see even airlines in America, big as they were merging.
Exactly.
They were merging.
Right.
Yeah. And then here, instead of merging, we are disintegrating. We need to go back to the origin. Cooperation, together we move ahead, divided we shall fall.
Okay, all right, speaking of collective effort, let's talk about the SATAM, Single African Air Transport market that you mentioned. 2018, here we are 2023. Have there been any growth indicators that we can pride in?
Actually, 2020, when you talk about the SATAM is a child of Yamoussoukro decision. The Yamoussoukro decision was done, Yamoussoukro declaration was done in Yamoussoukro in Côte d'Ivoire, in a town called Yamoussoukro. This was 1988. I had just joined the civil aviation then. 1988. Then they realized that the declaration was not having an impact. I think 2019, it became a Yamoussoukro decision. This is a decision that has been made by the summit at AU, 54 heads of states. We are still battling with it, 2023. So the only way we can have, and SATAM in itself alone will not solve the problems. It will not solve the problem.
So what problem does SATAM solve?
SATAM advocates for increased connectivity, removal of restrictions on freedoms. Aviation has 7 freedoms, so they increase, like Kenya Airways can come to Entebbe, drop, but pick also passengers and continue with them to Kigali, and also pick passengers from Kigali and take them to Johannesburg. So that's what we talk about. It will ease on opening up of the market and passengers, but we also have to remember that in terms of infrastructure, Africa's infrastructure is really not adequate. We need to invest in infrastructure, in navigational aids. If you're going to have a single airspace, you must have the equipment and tools to enable it. Some of these countries don't have it. Okay. I don't want to name them, but there's some which are obviously in bad shape.
Okay, all right. Thank you so much, gentlemen. We're going to be taking a short break. We'll be returning shortly. And of course, one of the conversations coming up is aviation safety and where we stand today and the future with technology. You're embracing full African air transport and its potential and the future of it. Of course, we had the question of security in line of artificial intelligence and the fast advancements in technology. Can Africa actually pass up with these advancements? But before we go into that conversation, there's a sustainable aviation fuel condition 2025, and we are few days to 2025, to be honest. Is Africa ready for that direction? Do we have the capacity?
Yeah, thank you. So first of all, I think net zero, which is net emissions of carbon, is 2050.
2050.
Not 2025. But there is a European requirement that you at least use a percentage of sustainable aviation fuel if you want to fly into Europe. And that is a requirement I think you're referring to 2025. Now, this is a very big discussion, but I'll try and be as succinct as possible. First of all, sustainable aviation fuel, what it's trying to solve is it's trying to solve global carbon emissions, okay? It's trying to create a cleaner environment. Aviation, globally, aviation contributes with not more than 2% of carbon emissions, okay? So in the scheme of things, it's actually not that big. But we are probably the most focused on when it comes to aviation, maybe because they see the airlines flying in the sky and they see it emitting carbon, and they say, yeah, you're depleting the ozone layer. But it is 2%, which of course we should try and reduce. Now, Africa, as Barry was saying earlier, we only have 2% of global traffic. So Africa contributes 2% of 2%, which is 0.04% of emissions. Now, fuel now contributes 64% of global emissions, okay? So if you look at all those things that I'm saying, is first of all, Africa is not a significant contributor to carbon emissions. I'm talking about aviation. But we are not saying that we should not participate in reducing carbon emissions. One of the other challenges that we have is Africa is playing below its level. 2% of global traffic is low because we are 18% of global population. So we have to fly more, is what I'm trying to say. In Europe, they're being asked to fly less so they can emit less. We are encouraging African airlines to fly more so that we can connect people and we can contribute to the economic development in Africa. So going back to SAF, Yes. SAF is 5%. We estimate that SAF, sustainable aviation fuel, is 5 times the cost of traditional fossil fuels. 5 times, which means that if we start using SAF 100% on the aircraft, it is going to increase the cost of aviation 5 times. And every time I ask travelers, and maybe I want to ask you, are you ready to pay 5 times the cost of...
No, we're ready to hear talking and finding out how you're going to help me cut the costs of my travel. Yes.
So that is a conundrum.
Yeah.
How do we use, on the one hand, SAF? And by the way, SAF, at the moment, the technology today, only 50%, you can only use 50% of it, the technology today. Okay, I know, I'm told new engines that are being produced are going to be using 100% SAF. The question, the big question, and people should never run away from this, is how are we going to reduce the cost of producing SAF to make it sustainable in terms of use, so that it does not, on the one hand, increase significantly the cost of air travel. And in Africa, we desperately need to reduce, as you know, we've been discussing this morning. Air travel in Africa needs to reduce significantly. We cannot afford increasing it. So how do you play that? There is a very big balance there to play. So how do we, on the one hand, reduce the emissions, which we are completely complying to, but on the other hand, reduce the cost of travel?
Mr. Kashambo, which brings us back to the regulation and compliance for Africa. We must, as you've rightly said, you audit them. There's no way around aviation and the policies and what has to be implemented. So in regards to SAF, how does Africa actually match up within the remaining time? Because I know that it comes at a heavy cost for governments, and also in the investment in aviation, which already there's huge investments that are actually pinching into the treasuries of the national governments.
Thank you very much. I'll add to what my brother Allan has alluded to. As we have net zero target is 2050. And the aviation sector, the aviation industry, is the only sector globally that has got a focus and defined timelines for getting to net zero. Remembering that aviation emissions, carbon emissions, contribute only 2%. The other boys who are emitting the 98%, some of them are factories in big states in China, in America, but they're not having as aggressive procedures to reduce the carbon as aviation does. We have what we call the Annex 16 to the Chicago Convention. It's very elaborate on what should be done to make sure that carbon emissions are reduced. However, as Allan mentioned, the cost of producing the sustainable aviation fuel and the technology involved is so expensive and so advanced that many African countries will not even dare to start. At the end of the day, the fuel is expensive, it's difficult to produce. The developing countries will be the ones to come and invest. Governments are not going to afford to invest in production of sustainable aviation. So this is going to be a private sector thing. Now, the private sector, who has the money in the private sector? It's the big economies. So at the end of the day, they will continue to dictate the cost of sustainable aviation fuel and its production. So we will continue to be consumers, just as we have been with the fossil oils. And let me wrap it up by saying, when you are talking of aviation safety fuels, the volumes that are required, I don't know how much a 787 needs full tank.
Now that you put me on the spot.
Yeah, I mean, you're talking of thousands, tons of liters.
Yeah.
Now, for you to produce tons of liters of sustainable aviation fuels from, I don't know, maize, sugar canes, whatever it is, you're going to have I don't know how many hectares of land that you're going to plant from. And we can't afford to do that because we'll be compromising now the same land we're using for coffee and food. Now we're going to divert it to start processing aviation safety, much as it is desirable, it's going to be an uphill task. We have the regulations, we have the requirements, but the issue is going to be how do we implement them? Are we going to be able to support to exercise that and make it cheaper for the airlines? Do we have the money to invest? Do we have the right people, the technology?
Is the private sector ready for that?
Is the private sector ready to invest in it?
To boost them up before
because the investment is enormous.
Yes.
So there are quite a few questions that are not easily answered.
Yeah.
And it's going to be an uphill task for Africa. It's desirable, but it can be difficult to be implemented and could be not feasible in some of the states.
Okay.
Maybe can I just add one very quick thought on this one? So I know the discussion now has been that we develop what is called synthetic oils. So away from what Barry was saying, which is biofuels. But still, what he's saying is true. The cost of producing synthetic sustainable aviation fuels
aviation alone
is extremely expensive. And even today, the availability. Today we have about, I'm told the availability is about 1% of the requirement of global aviation. And so by 2030, they're saying they'll maybe try and wrap it up to 20%.
Okay.
The question is, are we going to be able to attain the availability? Forget about the cost for a second. Is it actually going to be available for all these airlines? And you've heard recently airlines are expanding. But like Barry says, we are supportive. I support these emissions, but it is a very big uphill task.
Well, it begs the question of availability, but also sustainability, especially in the short term of it. But let's move away from that. Let's go to the Africa Airlines Association, and you're having the annual general meeting. Glad to be hosting it here in Kampala. I hope you have found Kampala beautiful. Christmas will be in Kampala for Mr. Kilavuka. All right, so in that regard, what are the priorities or what's on the agenda of discussion for Afra Annual General Summit?
Yeah, so we had the annual general meeting yesterday, and before that, the precursor to the annual general meeting was discussing the priorities for Afra. And just to mention a few of them, one is, the biggest one is really safety. Safety was on the top of the list. We've got to create safer spaces, and this is he's an expert on that area of safety. Unfortunately, and this is just a fact, sometimes we Africans need to be honest with ourselves. We've not been the safest airspace. In fact, the statistics that we were still looking at yesterday, unfortunately, have not been going in the right direction. That is just the truth. So we have put in place some mechanisms to try and encourage the industry to be a safer industry, because the kind of crash that we're having is not good. We are talking about SATAM that we have been discussing today, how to actualize it, how to fast track it. We're talking about reducing our costs of operation, and there are some specific initiatives that we're working on. For example, there's one that is called free routing, which is looking at the way we fly, basically. The way you fly, if you use a specific route, is more expensive than if you use a specific. If you go round, of course, you use more fuel than if you go straight. So those are some of the things that we're looking at. We've also admitted some few members and encourage our membership to be more active in this African Airline Association. All
right, time is not on our side, so let me give Mr. Kashambo the closing remarks, especially on safety, because we wanted to address that too.
Thank you very much. As he just mentioned, safety is my baby. I've been in that sector for over 40 years. As an engineer, as an airworthiness surveyor in the CAA, accident investigator, the regulations and leadership at regional and now continental level. So safety is paramount. But in itself alone, it's also not enough. You have to have safety. You have had security, especially in this region with terrorism being one of the threats. You've got air navigation and services, which is a big factor, as you mentioned. You must know how do you design the routes? Are they going to be too long? Can they be shortened? How high should you fly? Things like that. Then, of course, we have the environmental protection and lastly, the air development. But the reason why the International Civil Aviation was actually established in 1944 was for safety and air navigation. And they continue to be the prime priorities for airlines, for CAAs, and for International Civil Aviation Organization, ICAO. So the issue of safety is so important in that the safer you are, the better will be the confidence, the public confidence to fly with the airline. He talked about Africa having a very high accident rate. Sometimes I tend to disagree with it because accidents are rated in terms of 1 million flights. But because Africa, our flights are so few, statistically, when you look at one accident in Africa, because against one accident in America, the percentages in America, the percentage will be 0.00 something.
Yeah.
In Africa, it will be now 1% because of the small volume.
Okay.
So we definitely, but we must make safety a priority.
Yeah.
And we must give it priority. And let me close with this. Aviation will never thrive if we do not have the political will.
Right.
Governments must have aviation as a government priority, as one of the development factors or the development programs. And we have examples. Ethiopian Airlines. Ethiopian Airlines is a pride for every citizen of Ethiopia.
All right.
They take it, cherish it as a government asset. If we all could do that, I know Kenya, they, of course, is in the same category. South Africa was trying. But what we need to do is to have priority and love it at the highest political level.
Okay.
In Uganda, the highest political level is really supporting. And even if it wasn't for the support of the head of state, I don't think Uganda Airlines would have been established.
All right, Mr. Kashambo.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. That is Mr. Barry Kashambo, aviation specialist. We also have had the privilege of having the Group CEO, Kenya Airways, and Managing Director, Mr. Allan Kilavuka. Thank you so much for your time. And of course, it takes political will to have the collaborations that were mentioned. It takes political will to have the consolidation, the alliances, and of course, the cost cutting that comes down to easing aviation movement, free transport across Africa to support African trade, African development, and Africa being also a hub of aviation, leveling it up with the rest of the world. Thank you so much for having been a part of this conversation. I trust that it's been value addition. For now, we take a short breather. We return with a Tech Note. Do stay